Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1970. We're going to be taking a look at the band and they're going to be performing The Weight. So let's get the guys up on screen and see how they get on.
I put in the Nazareth, I was a-feeling about half-past 10. I just need to find a place where I can lay my head. Hey, mister, can you tell me where a man might find a bed? He just grinned and shook my hand, no was all he said. Take a load off, Fanny. Take a load for free. Take a load off, Fanny. And you put the load right on me. I picked up my bag. I wasn't looking for a place to hide. When I saw Carmen and the devil walking side by side, I said, hey, Carmen, come on, would you go downtown? And she said, well, I gotta go, but my friend can stick around and around. Take a load off, Fanny. Take a load for free. Take a load off, Fanny. You put the load right on me. Go on down, Miss Moses. There ain't nothing that you can say. 'Cause it's just old Luke and Luke's waiting on the judgment day. Well, now, Luke, my friend, what about young Annalise? He said, do me a favor, son, won't you stay and keep Miss Annalise company? And take a load off, Fanny. Take a load for free. Take a load off, Fanny. And you put the load right on me.
I'm just going to jump in here. As always, the link to this video is going to be in the description below, so you guys can watch it the whole way through. And this is 4 songs in total, so it's one of those videos that I won't be able to look at all of with this analysis, and we're just focusing on The Weight here. But the band, as a band, were one of those outfits that were supporting other artists to begin with. It was Ronnie Hawkins that they're playing behind, and then they moved on from there. In the mid-60s is when they got involved with Bob Dylan, and you can check out my video on Bob because I do mention them in there, but also for an independent look at Bob Dylan as an artist. But putting the spotlight on these guys because it's probably got to a point where, like I mentioned, they were playing behind Ronnie, but then adapted and realized that they could do everything themselves. So what we're looking at essentially is a group of guys who would have been looked at as a backing band or the session guys of the time, and everyone will know back in the late 50s, 60s, 70s, the guys in the studio, the session musicians, were the top of the pile when you're looking at technical ability and musicianship. And this is something that, when you look at a band such as the band, having that ability to play and sing at the same time, but also be so tight live. It was their job to be tight behind an artist, but then as soon as they're now the main focus of attention, you can see how tight they are, but the devil is in the detail, especially with a performance that seems so laid back and routine as this does. When I talk about that, just take a look at Levon Helm on drums, because he's supplying that vocal, but the drum work throughout this whole song is so spot on and drawing attention to the fills as well. I mentioned in other videos about drummers sometimes live can start to push the tempo. But here, Levon is so spot on throughout the whole performance. And go and listen to the original composition, the record, the original release, and just match it with this, because the groove and the feel is exactly the same. And when you consider that Levon is supplying that lead vocal at exactly the same time, it's just ever more impressive. And the thing that I love to listen to with this performance are those fills, because they are so rock solid. And when you listen to a lot of drummers, when they're not singing, the thing that can suffer are the fills, speeding up during a fill, and now you might be 1 or 2 beats faster per minute than you were before the fill. But it is so solid here from Levon throughout this whole performance. I always mention about having that solid rhythm section. We've got that here. You'd expect nothing less from a band of this quality, and it's Rick Danko on the left of the screen here playing bass, fretless bass by the way, that is supplying that solidity with Levon. And having that solid foundation means that everything placed on top of that is going to sound that much better, and it's going to be such a cohesive unit. Mentioning vocals, because this is something that as a backing band they would be expected to provide backing harmonies and have that ability, and then breaking off as an independent standalone band, it means that now you've got 4 out of 5 guys who can supply lead vocals and backing vocals, harmonies. So it is that luxury I always say about having just one extra singer in the band is such an advantage. But when you look down the list of performers in the band, and it'll give the instrument that they play after their name, but then also it'll say whether they provide vocals or not. When you look down the list of band names and 4 out of 5 are supplying vocals, you know there is so many places that they can take the melody vocally and the way that they can interact with each other, the compositions. Obviously it opens the door to go to so many interesting places. This is a great song to show the versatility of those vocals, because we have the repeated line that comes in 3 times, and it's ever so slightly staggered. So you get that harmony coming together, but also the effect of delay that you would have added in the studio. But because you've got 3 vocalists that can pull it off live, it means that you can bring that sound from the record to the live stage. We've got Robbie Robertson on guitar here as well, supplying all of that solid rhythm work and the intro, of course, and Garth Hudson and Richard Manuel on keys. And you'll find that we can hear the piano sound in there, but also the organ. So we've got 2 keys sections effectively working together. I always say in other videos how just having one keys player is great for filling in all of that frequency, all of that space underneath the guitars. And here, having just one guitar with a really clean tone, it means that there would be a lot of space underneath that needs to be filled. And it just so happens we've got that luxury of not 1, but 2 guys who can play keys in the background. We've got a really dry sound across the whole stage here because there's nothing on the vocal mics, and mix-wise, it's a little bit heavy on Rick's mic, I think. So it would have been better to even those up a little bit, but we still get a great sound because the band are so great. And this is what you'll find sometimes, that even with a bad mix, it still sounds good when the band are just a top band, and that's exactly what we've got here. But let's get back into the performance.
Crazy Chester followed me and he caught me in the fog. He said, I will fix your rack if you just take Jack, my dog. I said, wait a minute, Chester, you know I'm a peaceful man. He said, that's okay, boy, won't you feed him when you can? Take a load off, baby. Take a load to breathe. Take a load off, baby. And you put the load right on me. low, and I do believe it's time to get back at Miss Fanny. You know she's the only one who sent me here with her regards for everyone. And I want you to take a load off Fanny, take a load for free, take a load off Fanny. And you put the load right on me.
And there we have it. So, because we're now focused a little bit more on the bass work going on, we can have a look at Rick's technique, because it's something that you'll find with a lot of guitar players, having the thumb over the top of the guitar, but not so much with bassists, and the way that Rick just throws these bass lines together, but supplies the root note of the chord with his thumb over the top, so stretching right over there. Like I said, playing fretless bass here, and really so solid with his playing, singing at the same time, exactly the same across the board here. But all of these guys have that top technical ability as a band. But it's one thing to have technical ability, and it's a whole nother thing to write a song that is catchy, that is popular, that people can relate to. And the band managed to make that transition from supporting another artist to then having their own standalone songs. And this one was written by Robbie Robertson, and it's got all of those melodic components you want from a great song. So I always say in other videos that songwriting is the hardest part of the music industry, and as an artist or a band, just having that connection with an audience and writing something melodic that's going to be memorable and people want to listen to. Just to point out that we do have that change in lead vocal as well, from Levon to Rick, and just having that ability in a band to have two separate lead vocalists is such a luxury and such a rare thing as well. You don't really see a lot of bands sharing lead vocals, just a lead vocalist and then a harmony vocal in the background, maybe one or two of those. This performance falls into that category of being so good that people won't notice how good it is. And I'm specifically going to be talking about the tempo, the feel, the mood of the performance, as well as just nailing everything live, but getting that groove and feel exactly the same throughout the whole track. I mean, that is Levon on drums, supplying that lead vocal like I mentioned earlier, but having that solidity is something that is so solid and reliable that you don't notice how reliable and solid it is, because you can just sit back and listen. And you'll find that with a lot of artists who were standalone singers in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, when they performed live with a band, as the band were behind a standalone artist to begin with, they are so rock solid. The level of ability amongst those session musicians back at that time was just crazy, that they could turn up and just nail a performance with exactly the same feel and tempo. And I'm talking about guitar solos as well, just note for note, and sometimes not even note for note, but just a great alternative solo that might just have been live on that night. I do want to cover a little bit of the history quickly about the band, because they started out as the Hawks, and I mentioned Ronnie Hawkins earlier, who had this way of playing with other bands and hiring the best musicians from those bands to eliminate the competition. And that's how the band initially came about, and they were very popular in Toronto, and this would have been in the early 60s, but up until 1963 is when the band and the guys left Ronnie, because they felt like they had outgrown the sound and wanted to go in their own direction, because they had goals that they wanted to achieve as a band themselves. So in 1965 is when they teamed up with Bob Dylan, who was looking for a backing band, and initially they weren't popular at all. In an interview, Rick said that they were only applauded and cheered in France, and everywhere else they were booed and heckled, and this was the reason why Levon Helm left. He sat out the 1966 World Tour because of all the heckling that they had to experience at their gigs. And during that time, Levon worked on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. In 1966 is when Bob Dylan had his motorcycle accident, so he was recovering from that, and the guys rented a house which they called Big Pink, and if you've seen the pictures of it, it is big and it's pink, and in 1968 they released their debut album, and that was called Music from Big Pink, and that featured this song, The Weight, which was also featured in the movie Easy Rider, and that was a huge hit, the song, but also the movie. They had huge success with the debut album and played at Woodstock as well in 1969, but unfortunately they weren't featured on the film due to legal complications. On the album there was also a track called This Wheel's on Fire, and there were a few co-written tracks with Bob Dylan on that album, and This Wheel's on Fire, a lot of people here in the UK will know it, especially if they're fans of Absolutely Fabulous, because that is the theme song for that show. But in 1969 is when they released The Band, and on the previous album, the band name didn't really appear on there because it was just the name of the album and then the band and then the names listed of the band members. So in 1969, they were now known as The Band on this second album, and it has been widely referred to as a massive influence on many artists around at the time, including George Harrison and Eric Clapton as well. Clapton actually wanted to join the band, but unfortunately for Eric, it just didn't work out that way. People at the time were starting to refer to this sound as country rock because it was new, and other people would say that it paved the way for bands like the Eagles, who have multiple vocalists within the band and harmonize with each other, exactly as the band are doing here. In 1970, they released the album Stage Fright, and that was produced by Todd Rundgren, and if you want to check him out, he's here on the channel as well, independently. In the early 70s, they were starting to have a few problems because Robbie was taking more control of the band, or at least Levon was seeing it that way, and Robbie was citing drug use by other band members, but they kept on pushing forward. In 1971, they released Cahoots, and this was the first album that had Alan Toussaint involved, and he had a horn arrangement on Life is a Carnival, and Alan would then be involved in future projects as well. In 1971, they released their Rock of Ages live album, and in 1973, they had a joint tour with Bob Dylan and also backed him up on his album Planet Waves, which was released in 1974. In 1975, they released Northern Lights, Southern Cross, and in 1976 is when they decided to retire from touring and had their part in The Last Waltz, which was a massive concert, an event, and something that Martin Scorsese filmed and put it together as a concert film documentary. And that was released in 1978. But the year before that, they released their last album with the original lineup, and that was called Islands in 1977. In 1983, they did return to touring, but this was without Robbie. They were playing smaller venues than before, and unfortunately in 1986 is when Richard Manuel committed suicide. He was struggling with alcohol and drugs, as he had done for a long time in the 70s. He was clean for a few years at the end of the 70s, going into the 80s, but by 1984, unfortunately, he was back in the grasp of addiction. And in the 90s, they recorded a few more albums. In 1998 was the last album, and that was called Jubilation. And unfortunately, in 1999, Rick Danko died in his sleep, and that was of heart failure. So a sad end to the story, but again, we can use YouTube and teleport ourselves back to 1970 to check out the band live in action. And I think they are one of those bands that a lot of people know the songs. even if they didn't know that it was the band who played them in the first place. And I mentioned about them co-writing with Bob Dylan as well. Like I said, it's one thing to be a great band, but then it's another thing to actually have songs that people will remember and like, that will do well in the charts and connect with an audience en masse. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one.